Freeze! Don't move! Step away from the car right now!
I said step away.
Hands where I can see them. You want to explain to me what a man in dirty boots like you is doing loading groceries into a $300,000 Maybach?
Going home.
Funny. Put the keys on the hood, now.
I don't think so.
Excuse me?
You heard me.
The parking lot was quiet. The evening was ordinary. And then a patrol cruiser's emergency light split the air like a thunderclap, aimed not at a crime scene, not at a threat, but at a 70-year-old man loading groceries into his own car. What happened in the next 4 minutes would end a law enforcement career, trigger one of the fastest civil rights settlements in state history, and remind an entire nation that the most dangerous assumption a person can make is deciding they already know who someone is before asking a single question. Before this story goes any further, drop a comment right now and let us know where you are watching from. If you have ever witnessed someone being judged by their appearance before anyone bothered to learn who they actually were, type "seen it" in the comments below. Smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this one is going to stay with you. The Greenfield Organic Market parking lot was the kind of place that felt deliberately calm. Wide lanes. Clean asphalt. Soft lighting designed to make the evening feel unhurried. On a Sunday, the lot filled with the quiet routines of people running the last errand of the weekend, families with full carts, couples grabbing a bottle of wine, retirees taking their time. It was not the kind of place where anything was supposed to happen. Then the emergency lights came on. A patrol cruiser's roof bar ignited in rotating red and blue, cutting hard across the stillness of the lot. Nearby shoppers stopped mid-step. A woman with a full cart looked up, startled. A man walking toward the entrance slowed, turned. The blue-white pulse of the light swept across the face of a gleaming two-tone Mercedes Maybach GLS 600, $300,000 of brushed metal and German engineering sitting under the fluorescent glow like something that did not entirely belong in a grocery store parking lot. And standing beside it, completely still, was a 70-year-old black man in a torn, mud-caked work shirt, dusty boots, and sweat-darkened jeans. His hands were visible. His posture was unhurried. His expression gave away nothing. Officer Edward Calvo was already out of the cruiser and moving. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand what that Sunday had actually looked like for Raymond Lemus. He had been awake before sunrise. By the time most of the city was making coffee, Raymond was already on his rural property outside town, working with the particular discipline of a man who has spent decades doing exactly what needs to be done without waiting to be asked. He spent the morning hauling heavy bags of soil across uneven ground. He spent the afternoon with a chain and a truck pulling old tree stumps out of earth that had been holding them for years. He mended 2 sections of fence line that had buckled under the weight of a recent storm. He did all of it himself, the way he always did, and by the time the late afternoon sun began to flatten against the horizon, his flannel shirt was torn at the shoulder, his jeans were caked to the knee, and his boots left distinct, muddy prints wherever he walked. He did not stop to change. He did not stop to shower. He simply got in his car and drove to the store, because he wanted a fresh steak and a quiet evening, and he had earned both. Raymond moved through Greenfield the way he moved through everything, without performance and without apology. He took a cart. He chose his groceries with the unhurried attention of someone who knew what they wanted. He paid, exchanged a brief, pleasant word with the cashier, and pushed his cart back out into the evening air. At his vehicle, he loaded his bags with the same methodical deliberateness that characterized everything he did, then pressed the key fob. The Maybach's trunk descended with a soft, hydraulic hum, the quiet, expensive sound of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. Raymond's hand was already reaching for the cart to return it when the lights hit him. Officer Edward Calvo had been cruising the parking lanes for the better part of 20 minutes. 28 years old, with just over 3 years on the force, Calvo had built a specific kind of reputation among the officers who had worked alongside him, not for competence, but for aggression worn as confidence. He treated field stops as performances and fellow officers who preferred de-escalation as obstacles. His supervisors had noted, in language carefully selected to be noncommittal, that Calvo had a tendency toward what they described as proactive enforcement in situations that did not always warrant it. There had been informal complaints. There had been conversations. Nothing had been formally documented, because nothing had yet produced consequences significant enough to demand it. That was about to change. When Calvo's cruiser rolled past the section of lot where the Maybach sat, his eyes moved to the vehicle first, the kind of car that draws attention in any context, and then to the men beside it. The sequence of that visual processing was its own kind of evidence. He saw the car. He saw the men. He saw the torn shirt and the dusty boots and the mud dried into the denim. And somewhere in the space between observation and decision, a conclusion formed that had nothing to do with law enforcement protocol and everything to do with assumption. He did not run the plates. That would have taken less than 90 seconds and would have returned the vehicle as registered, insured, and belonging to a man with a clean record extending back further than Calvo had been alive. The information was available. The procedure existed precisely to prevent what was about to happen. Calvo bypassed it entirely. His hand hit the emergency lights. The cruiser surged forward, swerving across the driving lane and cutting off the row at a hard diagonal angle, boxing the Maybach in. The move was aggressive enough that a woman near the cart returned physically startled. The sound of the cruiser's door throwing open and Calvo's boots hitting the pavement carried across the lot with a weight that made the nearest bystanders look up and stay looking. Calvo closed the distance fast, his chin raised, his right hand resting on his duty belt with the practiced casualness of a man signaling intent without yet committing to it. His voice, when it came, was loud enough to carry, designed to establish control of the scene before any conversation began. Raymond did not move quickly. He turned his head first, registering the approaching officer with an expression that contained no fear and no hostility, only the careful, evaluative attention of a man taking a precise reading of a situation. He pressed the key fob a second time. The trunk, still slightly ajar, completed its descent with a soft thud. Then Raymond turned fully and placed his hands where they were easy to see. Calvo arrived in his space too fast and stopped too close. The distance between them was deliberate, a physical assertion of dominance that Raymond recognized and absorbed without reaction. When Calvo demanded to know whose vehicle it was, framing the question inside a contemptuous observation about the kind of men who shop at places like Greenfield and the kind of men who drive cars like the Maybach, Raymond's answer came without hesitation and without volume. He was the registered owner of the vehicle. Calvo's response to that was not to verify it. It was to mock it. The demand for the keys followed. Raymond declined. That single, quiet refusal, one word, no elaboration, hit Calvo with a force he was visibly unprepared for. The flush that moved up the officer's neck was immediate. His voice climbed. He began constructing a legal justification in real time, reaching for language about suspected stolen property and probable cause, language that had no factual basis and that Raymond, who had spent 42 years in courtrooms, recognized as fabricated on the spot. Raymond reached into his back pocket slowly, narrating the movement in a clear, level voice directed not at Calvo but at the body camera mounted on Calvo's chest. He produced a standard state driver's license and extended it forward. Calvo took it with unnecessary sharpness and then did something that stripped away any remaining pretense of procedure. He unclipped the tactical flashlight from his shoulder strap and directed the full beam directly into Raymond's face. It was not an investigative tool in that moment. It was an intimidation tactic, and both men understood exactly what it was. Raymond did not turn away. He absorbed the light with the same stillness he had brought to the entire confrontation, squinting slightly but holding his ground and his eye contact with a composure that seemed to irritate Calvo further with every passing second. The license came back clean. No warrants. No flags. No record of any kind. Calvo held it for a long moment, and then he made his next decision. He doubled down. He keyed his radio and reported a hostile, non-compliant suspect, a description that bore no relationship to the man standing in front of him, who had not raised his voice, had not moved aggressively, and had narrated his every action aloud for the camera. A second unit was dispatched. More eyes would be on this parking lot within minutes. The bystanders had already made their own decision. Phones were out across a radius of 30 feet, a man near the cart return, a couple by a parked sedan, a teenager by the store entrance. The scene was being recorded from multiple angles simultaneously, and none of those recording it had been asked to stop. When Calvo reached forward and grabbed Raymond by the shoulder, thick leather glove twisting the torn flannel, attempting to spin the older man around and force him against his own vehicle. The gesture was caught on every single one of those cameras. Raymond stiffened his stance and absorbed the force without yielding, without striking back, without any movement that could be mischaracterized. He looked at the hand on his shoulder. He looked at the officer's face. And then, in the same voice he used when correcting a misapplication of law from the bench, he told Calvo, steadily, without heat, with the particular authority of a man who has never needed to raise his voice to be heard, that he was making a very serious mistake. Calvo did not process it as a warning. He processed it as resistance. His hand moved to his belt, reaching for the handcuffs with the certainty of a man who believed the situation was completely within his control. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. The second cruiser arrived without theater. Its headlight swept across the lot in a wide, steady arc, and Sergeant David Ramirez stepped out with the deliberate calm of a man who had been doing this long enough to read a scene before anyone had to explain it to him. He was older than Calvo by nearly 15 years. He had the posture of someone who understood that control was most effective when it was quiet. His eyes moved across the lot in a single, practiced scan, the bystanders, the phones, the frozen shopping carts, the Maybach boxed in at a hard angle, and something in his expression shifted before he had taken 3 steps toward the confrontation. Calvo had the handcuffs out. That was the first thing Ramirez clocked. The sergeant approached with his palms open and his voice low, inserting himself into the space between the two men with the practiced ease of someone who had de-escalated far worse. He addressed Calvo first, not loudly, not reprimandingly, but with the particular firmness of a superior officer who is offering a subordinate one final opportunity to stop making things worse. Raymond Lemus watched all of this without moving. He had been watching it from the beginning, not passively, but with the focused attention of a man who had spent 4 decades reading rooms for a living. He had known, from the moment Calvo's cruiser lights ignited, that the most important thing he could do was allow the confrontation to fully construct itself on camera before he dismantled it. Every command Calvo had issued, every contemptuous assumption he had voiced, every physical intrusion he had made, all of it was documented. The record was complete. And now, with the sergeant present and the audience at its largest, the moment had arrived. Raymond reached into the breast pocket of his mud-stained flannel shirt. Not the back pocket where the driver's license had come from. The front breast pocket, a small, flat compartment that held a single item. A worn leather wallet, dark with age, unremarkable in every external detail. He moved slowly and announced his intention in a clear voice directed at both men by rank, a habit so deeply embedded from decades on the bench that it operated independent of circumstance. He informed them he was presenting proper identification. The wallet opened. The gold judicial seal caught the parking lot lights the way metal catches sunlight, a hard, sudden flash that was impossible to look away from. Beneath it, embossed on a credential card that had been issued by the state and renewed every 4 years without incident, were the words that rearranged everything: Honorable Raymond Lemus, Chief Judge, 12th Judicial District Court. Sergeant Ramirez went completely still. It was not the stillness of confusion. It was the stillness of recognition, immediate, total, and devastating in its implications. Ramirez had stood at a witness stand in the 12th Judicial District more times than he could count without effort. He had looked up at that bench. He had watched Raymond Lemus preside over proceedings with the particular authority of a man who had been doing it for longer than most of the officers in that department had been alive. He knew exactly what that seal represented, and he knew, with the clarity that only comes from being present at an irreversible moment, exactly what had just happened in this parking lot. Calvo's reaction arrived in pieces. His mouth opened. The handcuffs, still in his right hand, seemed to grow heavier. The certainty that had carried him through every aggressive beat of the last 20 minutes did not collapse all at once, it fractured slowly, each piece falling away as the full weight of what he had done settled into place. The contemptuous officer who had shined a flashlight into an old man's eyes and grabbed his shoulder in front of a crowd had just done all of that to the chief judge of the judicial district that governed his department, his badge, and his future. Raymond did not raise his voice. He had not raised it once during the entire encounter, and he did not raise it now. He stated, plainly and without embellishment, the facts of what had occurred. No crime had been committed, no reasonable suspicion had existed, and every action Calvo had taken from the moment he stepped out of his cruiser had been captured on video from no fewer than 6 simultaneous angles. He did not threaten. He did not perform outrage. He simply placed the truth on the table with the same economy of language he used when delivering a ruling, and he let it sit there. Ramirez moved immediately. He stepped fully between the two men, his back to Raymond and his attention locked on Calvo, his voice dropping to something that did not carry beyond the two of them. What passed between them in that exchange was visible only in Calvo's body, the stiffening of the shoulders, the jaw working against itself, the slow and awful recognition that the sergeant was not there to support him. Several bystanders were still recording. Others had already lowered their phones and were moving toward their cars with the purposeful energy of people who understood they had witnessed something significant and intended to share it. At this point, as those videos began moving across every platform within the hour, one question kept surfacing in comment section after comment section. If Raymond Lemus had been an ordinary man with no gold seal, no judicial credentials, no 42 years of institutional authority behind him, what would that night have looked like? Drop "justice" in the comments if you think the outcome would have been completely different, and share this video so more people see what real accountability looks like. Raymond declined any further engagement at the scene. He did so politely, without drama, collecting his grocery bags from the pavement where they had been set down during the confrontation. He placed them in the Maybach with the same unhurried precision he had used to load them in the first place. He got in the car. He drove home. He grilled his steak. While he ate, the internet was already on fire. 6 separate recordings of the incident had been uploaded within 40 minutes of Ramirez's arrival. Each captured a different angle of the same sequence: Calvo boxing in the Maybach, closing the distance too fast, the flashlight in Raymond's face, the grab at the shoulder, and then the still, luminous moment when the gold seal opened in the parking lot light. That last moment was the one that moved fastest. Clipped, captioned, and reshared at a velocity that overwhelmed the platforms hosting it, the image of a dignified 70-year-old black man in torn farm clothes standing unmoved beside a $300,000 car while a young officer held handcuffs and unraveled was not merely dramatic, it was legible. It required no explanation. Every person who watched it understood exactly what they were seeing. By midnight, the story was trending across 3 states. By dawn, it had gone national. Morning news producers were cutting together the bystander footage between segments. Legal analysts were dissecting Calvo's conduct frame by frame, identifying no fewer than 4 distinct procedural violations before the confrontation reached its midpoint. Former law enforcement officers were being pulled into studios to comment, and the ones who had spent careers doing the job correctly were not gentle in their assessments. Civil rights attorneys in 2 cities had already made calls to Raymond's office before the sun was fully up. Edward Calvo spent that night at home. The following morning, he arrived at the department parking lot and sat in his personal vehicle for a long time before going inside. His phone screen showed the clip of himself reaching for the handcuffs on a national morning broadcast, his face visible, his badge number readable, the contempt in his posture unmistakable to anyone watching. The man he had looked at and seen nothing worth respecting was, at that precise moment, the most consequential person he had ever encountered. That understanding did not arrive as insight. It arrived as the specific, settling weight of a future that had already changed shape. The legal response did not come in anger. It came in the language of precision, organized, documented, and filed within 72 hours of the incident with the kind of structural thoroughness that made it immediately clear this was not a complaint assembled in haste. Raymond Lemus's legal team moved with the unhurried confidence of people who had spent decades building exactly this kind of case. The federal civil rights complaint they submitted was detailed enough to function as its own evidentiary record, layering the parking lot footage against constitutional statute with an efficiency that left very little room for counterargument. The discovery process that followed did what discovery is designed to do: it revealed what had been deliberately kept quiet. Officer Edward Calvo's personnel file, accessed under court order, produced a documented history that his department had possessed and declined to act on. 11 stops over less than 3 years in which the racial disparity was statistically impossible to attribute to anything other than pattern. 3 formal complaints from members of the public, each processed and filed without disciplinary action. 2 internal memos, authored by supervisors who had written with Calvo, that described concerns about his field judgment in language careful enough to avoid consequence. The department had not missed these signals. They had received them, catalogued them, and chosen an action, a choice that now sat at the center of a federal lawsuit alongside the parking lot footage. The city's legal team delivered their assessment to the mayor's office within the first week. The footage was irrefutable. The pattern was documented. The plaintiff held the most senior judicial position in the district that governed the city's court proceedings. If the case went to open trial, the exposure, reputational, financial, and institutional, would be severe and prolonged. The recommendation was unambiguous: settle, and settle quickly. The city did not fight it. The settlement was reached in under 2 months, at a figure that crossed 8 digits, one of the fastest resolutions of its scale in the state's recent legal history. The speed of it was itself a form of admission. When institutions move that fast to close a case, they are not demonstrating efficiency. They are demonstrating the recognition of catastrophic liability. What Raymond did with that settlement was the detail that stopped even his own legal team mid-conversation when he announced it. He directed every dollar, without exception, without personal retention of any amount, into a newly established foundation structured around 2 operational programs. The first provided free legal representation to community members who could not afford counsel during police encounters, filling a gap that Raymond had watched widen over 40 years from his bench. The second developed mandatory bodycam literacy and bias recognition training in partnership with university law departments, designed not as punitive curriculum but as substantive reform. He named neither the foundation nor its programs after himself. When asked why, his answer was brief and characteristic: the work was the point. The professional consequences arrived in sequence and without reprieve. Edward Calvo was terminated from the department within weeks of the settlement. His law enforcement certification, the credential that authorized him to carry a badge and a weapon in any capacity within the state, was permanently revoked. Not suspended. Not restricted. Revoked, with no pathway to reinstatement. He could not be hired by another department. He could not transition into adjacent law enforcement roles. His career, which had begun at 25, ended at 28, closed not by a single moment of poor judgment but by a documented pattern of bias that the parking lot incident had finally made impossible to ignore. A separate civil suit, brought by advocacy organizations that had been independently tracking his stop patterns for over a year, moved forward on its own timeline. Sergeant David Ramirez was reassigned rather than disciplined, a distinction that carried its own meaning. He was placed at the center of the department's mandatory retraining program, a position that required him to confront, professionally and repeatedly, the precise failure he had arrived just in time to witness. Those who worked alongside him in that capacity described a man who understood the assignment without needing it explained. He had testified in too many courtrooms to be unclear about the cost of institutional negligence. The department itself did not emerge unchanged. New protocols mandating plate verification before any vehicle stop were written into procedure. Mandatory review cycles for officers accumulating community complaints were formalized in policy for the first time. A revised escalation framework removed individual discretionary authority in ambiguous situations until supervisory presence was confirmed on scene. These were not cosmetic adjustments. They were structural, and they bore the specific shape of what had been absent on a Sunday evening in a grocery store parking lot. Raymond Lemus returned to his property the following weekend. He was up before sunrise. He put on his boots before most of the city had made coffee, walked out to his land, and did the work that needed doing, the same way he always had. The flannel shirt he wore that morning was similar to the one that had been on his back when Calvo grabbed his shoulder. His boots collected the same mud. The Maybach sat in the driveway, and when the work was finished, he drove it to the store. What the headlines had compressed into a single dramatic incident was, for Raymond, simply one evening in a life built on a foundational conviction that most people carry as an abstract ideal but very few manage to inhabit completely. 42 years on the bench, the last 18 as chief judge. Dozens of young attorneys and public defenders brought along quietly, mentored not through formal programs but through the slower, more demanding method of sustained attention and honest feedback. A man who had helped rewrite sections of the state's police oversight statutes not because the work was visible, but because he believed the law was only as functional as the accountability structures supporting it. The video of that night did not fade. It became a fixture, embedded in law school ethics syllabi, used in police training modules, cited in civil rights seminars as a case study in the gap between assumed authority and actual institutional power. The image returned, in those contexts, not as spectacle but as evidence, a 70-year-old man in torn work clothes, standing composed and still beside a $300,000 car, absorbing the full force of a biased officer's certainty without yielding a single inch, and waiting, with the patience of someone who had always understood that the truth does not need to be performed, only preserved. Raymond had returned to the question himself, in the measured language of someone who had turned it over carefully before speaking. The law's fundamental design, as he framed it, was blindness, a deliberate incapacity to weigh appearance against outcome, to calculate the cost of a vehicle against the assumed station of its driver, to arrive at a verdict before a single verified fact had been established. When it failed to be blind, when it looked at a man's boots before asking his name, it had already broken its own premise. The only repair available was accountability, applied without distinction, regardless of the rank of the person who required it. On a quiet Sunday evening, some weeks after the settlement closed and the news cycle had moved on, Raymond Lemus pulled the Maybach into the Greenfield Organic Market parking lot. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same as they always had. He took a cart. He moved through the aisles with his characteristic unhurried attention. He chose what he needed, paid, and pushed his cart back out into the evening air. He loaded his groceries. He drove home. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said a word. The most powerful person in that parking lot did what he had always done, exactly as he pleased, in exactly the clothes he chose to wear, without waiting for anyone's permission or recognition. Because he had never needed either. If this story stayed with you, if you believe accountability should have no exceptions and justice should have no dress code, smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Drop unbothered in the comments if Raymond Lemus earned your respect tonight. Share this video. Some stories need to travel further than the algorithm will take them on its own. We will see you in the next one.